everybody to our fourth edition of our Blockchain for Europe Summit. Thank you all for joining us here. Last year, unfortunately, we had to do this online, so I think everybody's really happy to have people in the room again and being able to, meet, touch, feel, talk, the real experience basically again. And that's really something everybody was looking forward on our side, and I hope also on your side. So we're really excited to have you all here, to hopefully have two very interesting, exciting, educating 2 days where we would like to talk about a lot of issues that I think all of us care about. I mean, obviously, we're in the heart of Europe. We're in Brussels. Regulation is king here. Policy is made here. People really care about this in our industry, and we wanted to bring those two worlds together today and tomorrow, where policymakers, commission staff, and members of the industry and academia can meet together, talk about things that both of them care, to find solutions that make Europe a better market, a better workplace, a future-proof environment that is innovative and exciting, and hopefully makes everybody feel better about where Europe is at this point. Especially, the situation is a bit less positive as everybody would hope for, but I think we're all working together to make it, or to take the next step at least on the innovation side of things. And that's what we want to discuss today. So we will discuss issues like MiCA, we will discuss issues like AML, we will discuss stablecoins, the digital euro, decentralized finance, NFTs, self-sovereign identity, sustainability, the Data Act, and a lot of other things that are very relevant to our ecosystem and our economy. And I don't want to take too much time from our really nice speakers this 2 days. So we'll make this short. There's just a number of things I really want to highlight to all of you. And that's, first of all, if anybody looking for the Wi-Fi, there's on the tables, there's plates where you can look them up. There's an app with the program, which you should see here. Perfect, thanks. And so in case you're wondering like what's happening next and you don't know by heart, no problem, just open it and then you will see everything. And there's a quiz for the ones of you that want to test yourself on blockchain or crypto or DeFi and things. There's paper running around that you can do those testing with. And there's, again, on the other side, a QR code. So feel free to have a look. We put some effort in there to give the idea of, or rather to help to understand what this is all about. Most of you obviously know, but there's nuances to it, and some of you are here probably to also learn something or learn more or educate themselves, so please use it. We will have then 3 coffee breaks, very simple, one after this panel, so in case you haven't had enough coffee yet, there will be more. Please feel free to get it. There will be a lunch break at 2:30, if I'm not mistaken. If anybody knows better, or correct me, please, but I'm pretty sure it's 12:30. And then there's 2 more coffee breaks, so we try to make it as digestible as possible, right? So that you don't have to sit here for like 5 hours in a row, but you can pretty much, refill your coffee tank whenever you need. There's obviously also other things, water. And then at the end of the day, we have a very nice reception. And that leads me to the last point. I want to thank, apart from our members who obviously helped to organize it, also our contributors that we have, and you can see them on the side. So I want to thank in alphabetical order Binance, Cardano Foundation, Circle, the Climate Collective, and TRM Labs. And obviously, last but not least, but without them, this couldn't have worked out, the team of the Secretariat. So thank you guys for putting so much hard work in there, and I hope you will enjoy these 2 days. If you want to know somebody or you want to get introductions, the team is here to help you guys connect, because that's what this is all about, to enrich everybody's experience here. There should be nameplates which say team. Just grab one of them and ask if you need anything. I hope we will be able to help you. And apart from that, I would like to invite our speakers now to the panel. So from European Parliament, Ondrej Kovarik. Gabriel, very sorry with your name. I'm not very good in French. Gabriel Cumenge from the French Ministry of Economy. I hope I didn't make a mess out of it. Welcome. Wherever you want, please. Hugo Coelho from Binance. And last but not least, Caroline Malcolm from Chainalysis. So please welcome our first panel. I hope you'll enjoy it. Thanks for being here. Whichever you want. So as you know, the European blockchain environment spent quite an amount of time in talking about MiCA in the last years. And the reason why we chose this topic to start with, it's because, first of all, it took a lot of effort of all the people involved to bring it to a positive end, which we achieved like 2 weeks ago now. Doesn't mean that it's over. There's a lot of follow-up work to be done. And it's also important to understand what MiCA means for the industry and for everybody that is involved in this particular environment. And that's why we want to start with this. We have a very distinguished panel here today from both the industry and the policymakers. So we have the pleasure to have the 2 co-legislators represented from the European Parliament and the Council, and 2 very distinguished experts from the industry to discuss what does MiCA actually mean, what does it do, where does it go, and what's next, and which are the points that we still need to take care of, because it's such a vast regulation that there's a lot of points inside the regulation that still probably need some follow-up discussion, and that's what we want to do today. If you have any questions, then please, the last 10 minutes we want to use for Q&A. So please don't be shy, just raise your hands, and there should be somebody with a microphone running around and let you ask questions. So thanks for that. And I want to start with Gabriel. You've been part of the negotiating team of the French presidency, which until late was in charge of MiCA. You pretty much drove it to the finish line. And for that reason, I would like to give you the floor to explain a bit like, what's the perspective on which MiCA ended from a French perspective or a council perspective, maybe it's that easier, and outline why you think this is such a relevant and important regulation and what will it bring to the industry. Very easy, I hope. So please, floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and good day to everyone here. We discussed with the Parliament actually, including Ondrej, during the French presidency up to the last minute, but the last hour, in trilogue to nail what we call a political agreement. But we should give the credit also to the Czech presidency after us, that is doing the hard job of going through the tiny details and the commas. So the text was hopefully be entering into force in next April, because then, you know, I mean, there are a number of languages in Europe, so we need to have proper text in all languages. Maybe just a few words. When you consider from a regulator's point of view and public authority, the emergence of a new industry, a new sector, and new use cases like that, coming with a number of very innovative use cases, very innovative forms of incorporating the business. There is a dilemma, basically, for regulators. Do you want to act quickly, very fast, so that you provide the legal framework, but with the drawback that you might not know what's really happening and what will be happening? First, because there is a question of understanding what's happening, and there is a learning curve for regulators, and there will be a learning curve also for supervisors when implementing MiCA. And second, because it takes time for the industry to structure itself. Typically, this is the 4th annual summit, and blockchain is way older than 4 years old. But still, I think we are in the early stages of the structuration of the business and the industry. And it's also helpful for regulators to have counterparts, like professional associations, like businesses that have stood the test of time. So you have this first option. You have the second option, which is to say, okay, guys, I already have a number of layers of regulations, typically for traditional finance, if we're talking about that part of the business. And I'll deal with new business upcoming and new industry with the old framework, and I'll let time for the new industry to develop. And there, of course, it's more satisfying because you will act knowing what you're acting on, but at the same time, I mean, you want to avoid acting too late. And typically, I mean, that was part of the discussion we had in the Council and with the European Parliament regarding stable coins. Basically, no meaningful euro-denominated or other currencies of the EU-denominated stablecoins. Yet, a lot of dollar-denominated stablecoins developing. What do you do? And would it be a problem if you act too late and the market and the participants and the customers are already acting on something that is not sovereign? So coming back to why MiCA? MiCA, I mean, we all know why MiCA. MiCA because of what I call the great Libra fear, the great Libra scare, which today isn't a scare anymore, okay, regarding the Libra, but still, I mean, that's where it comes from. That's the negative incentive to act. But there is also a positive incentive to act, which is that, as we can see in the data, Europe and European countries and European customers have been quite active on the front of taking the blockchain technology and making it a new platform for new businesses, new use cases, and with a lot of promises that are yet to be fulfilled, I have to say, from a regulator's point of view, but still you want to help that. So now coming to MiCA, I think, I mean, I won't be long. This is a landmark regulation from our point of view, because this is the first of its kind in a significant jurisdiction in the world. So we hope that it will help anchor the principles of regulation for the industry worldwide, and at least give us in Europe the certainty that there will be native-born framework and industry developing in Europe for European customers and for European corporates. Then maybe two remarks regarding the way forward. The first one is that, as you said, there is still a number of development to have in the next few years, because entry into force next year. But basically, the full-fledged regulation will be active in 2024, 2025, because there are a transitional period. The legislator wanted that because we want to adapt to an ecosystem that's already there and that needs to adapt, and by providing some clarity on the framework that will be in place. But at the same time, there are a number of challenges regarding level 2 legislation by the Commission, RTS, so standards that will be key for businesses in this room. How do the supervisors implement the standards? There are a number of review clauses. I think you'll probably talk about that. Environmental impact, what to do with NFTs, what to do with DeFi. MiCA has been devised as a future-proof legislation. So it will be evolving, but in a framework that is stable. That is the idea. And then there will be a specific European task, which is consistency in implementation all over the internal market. And that's not a given. So probably we will receive a lot of feedback from you guys, and that's where having a structured industry is very helpful for regulators and supervisors, because there will be experimentation and learning curve in implementing MiCA. The second remark is that it wasn't intended so, but MiCA will come at a time that is a very uncertain juncture for the industry, I think, because, of course, of the macroeconomic conditions. And we're in a phase where we will see the end of the current high liquidity and free money times. So there is a question from the regulator's point of view. Will the business be able to flourish as it has flourished over the past few years with scarce liquidity and probably a much more stringent differentiation between businesses that have a case and businesses that don't. So it will be interesting for us to see that. Second thing is that, I mean, the promises of the industry are there, but it's still in the early stages for big scale customer use cases. Typically, in terms of payments, the promises of cheap and fast payments are still promises. So we'll see if it can develop, and there is an interest for Europe there. And we think MiCA can provide the framework for that. And second thing is for corporates, where we're really, really keen to see if the promises can be kept and if the industry can disrupt a little bit what traditional finance has to offer, but for the benefit of corporates. So I'll stop there. I've been too long, but that is what I wanted to say, that this is an evolutive framework. But the promise that we make from the council point of view, at least, is that it should be stable in the broad framework for the next few years and could help the industry navigate the uncertain economic times that are coming.
Thanks, Gabriel. Much appreciated. Ondrej, when you think back on the process and maybe seeing now the outcome, what are the things you're most appreciative of that were achieved, and where are the ones, I mean, Gabriel just mentioned some of the follow-up action that potentially will be needed. Which are the ones where you think like there's still work to be done, or maybe there's work coming from somewhere else that needs to be done and the parliament can play an active role? I know there's a resolution coming out in the parliament on NFTs, for example. So when you take a resume of MiCA has been done, where are the upsides and where are the downsides, to make it a bit more simple?
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and for the possibility to intervene on this panel. I think, to be honest, for me, MiCA, it only starts today here. I think, I mean, we did a lot of work, and it's true that we were actually working on the file until the very last hours of the French presidency, and a lot of work was also done under the Czech presidency in terms of technical and legal precision. But I think the reality with MiCA will only start when it's applied. And I think both the industry, but also the supervisory part is actually now preparing for that. And we will see how exactly it will function when it's fully applied, how it will be actually understood and applied and implemented in 27 member states, which I think will be critical point, because obviously there's a lot of tasks that are given to the national competent authorities, which then would have to supervise the market, and also the industry, as it has been rightly mentioned, with the current economic situation and the forecast of what is ahead of us. But coming back to your question, I think what I see as the main benefits, it's actually that we managed to have a regulatory framework that is basically harmonized, I would even dare say unified, across the 27 member states, across the entire single market. And I think one of the reasons that we're actually leading to the fact that we were discussing MiCA and that the Commission proposed MiCA was that apart from the Libra fear, I think a bit earlier than that was actually the fact that some national governments, some member states were already introducing their own rules for the industry. In France, in Germany, we saw it actually coming, and I think that would be a much more difficult position for the industry if we have specific national frameworks sort of coming up, and then we already see it, for example, for AML rules, right? I mean, how difficult it is to comply with different frameworks. So I think the key, in my view, was actually to come up with a regulatory framework that applies to the entire single market. That I think has been successfully achieved. I praise, the basic principles such as passporting of licenses and et cetera, et cetera. I think these are actually important things that may help the industry to grow, scale up, and innovate in the European Union. That's, I think, on one hand. The second point I would mentioned as a benefit. I think it actually gives clarity into the industry. There's a number of rules. In my view, maybe there's maybe too many rules, but let's see if that is necessary. But there is a number of rules that set sort of clear environment, the business environment for the industry in Europe, which I think is important, and it also gives a little bit of predictability in terms of how it will evolve. And I think this is something that will definitely have an impact on the industry and on the market. We have in many countries now providers, for example, working or operating without any licensing or with very light form of licensing. I think this will be transformed. There's a lot of rules in terms of how the crypto asset services providers should operate in the EU now. But I think this is also sort of in my view, a necessary step forward with the way the industry grows. So I think this is a second point. And another point, which I would follow up to what has been said, I think we are actually in Europe sort of setting standards in terms of the global legal environment. And I think this is also important. I mean, we see discussions in the US, we see discussions on crypto under the G20 format. We have recently saw a recommendation from FSB. So you see there's a lot of things actually happening also in terms of regulatory work across the globe. And I think we've taken a bold step forward. We made a bet that if we adopt such a framework earlier, then we can be actually leaders as EU in this debate. It doesn't mean that all the jurisdictions will copy-paste what we have in MiCA, I don't think so. But it can actually inspire other jurisdictions when they advance in their regulatory work. And it can actually help a better harmonization of the global environment across the world. So I think this would be among the benefits. In terms of some negative aspects or aspects that I would perceive as more negative, I think we've possibly over-regulated some of the parts. I think we could have been a bit more rather principle-based than prescriptive on issues like for instance stablecoins. I think we went quite far in terms of how strict the regulatory framework should be. Also, I think in terms of making or specifying clear differences between big players in the industry, so global companies that can actually afford compliance work and can actually act really on a global scale, compared to small and medium-sized companies that are just starting their activities. I think we could have done a slightly better job there. I mean, there are some guarantees for small companies to start business with softer requirements, but I think we could have been in this we could have been actually more helpful for small industries. But in my view, these will be fully tested when MiCA is fully applied. And I think, and that would be my sort of a call to finish my introductory remark to the industry. I mean, it was great, and with a lot of you, we were actually in touch throughout the work on MiCA, but I think we should actually intensify this even more, because through the implementation phase, we would really need to know exact feedback of how actually you are dealing with the requirements set by MiCA in various member states, and to come back to us, because as it has been said, there will be a lot of follow-up work also from the Commission on review of how MiCA works, and I think we should actually be able to feed in all these experiences with MiCA into this report and see if some adjustments would be needed at the later stage. But I think that would be my call, actually, to if you think that we are done, no, we just start.
Thanks, Ondrej. I would like to give now the floor to Caroline and Hugo. I think we just touched on two things that are very important. First of all, what's the impact of MiCA from a global perspective? And you both work and operate in a global environment. And that's the first one. And the second one is, where do you see pain points that we still need to be addressed? I mean, we have two of our co-legislators sitting here that probably will be very keen to listen to them. And maybe I'll start with you, Caroline. How would you address those two things, and what's your view on the global impact of MiCA more broadly?
Sure. So I think Ondrej's made a good point that the development of MiCA is very much a breakthrough for the industry, not just here in Europe, but globally. It will set a benchmark, a point of reference for other countries as they begin to develop their own frameworks. And certainly, already across the globe, we have seen some isolated cases of some degree of a policy framework for crypto assets. But this is, without question, the most comprehensive for one of the largest markets. Obviously, not just large in terms of, general economic terms, but when we think about the crypto ecosystem in particular, a lot of the focus, can tend to be on what's happening in the US, for example. But what the data really shows us, and we've just published some information about this, is that Europe, in terms of general adoption, is one of the largest markets for crypto assets in the world. And that's why it makes it so important. And really, for the criticisms that may be there in terms of MiCA, such a big step forward that we do finally have this framework in place, and almost to a point in terms of coming to this question of criticisms. This is something which has been in the works for a long time. We now have the sort of structure to it. There is still, though, a lot of detail that we're waiting to be seen. And I think, we've already touched on stable coins. And I think, just thinking about the thresholds that have been proposed, there's still a lot of questions about how those will actually work in practice, what will be required of issuers and intermediaries who might be dealing with stable coins when those thresholds are reached, what circumstances they apply. And so a lot of that detail is still to be fleshed out. And I think, almost to the point that, in a sense, that now that we know it's going to happen, getting that detail out as quickly as possible. I mean, I appreciate the challenge for the regulators in developing that level 2 detail, but having that out and having that worked through as quickly as possible will, in fact, be quite important. And I think perhaps the second point is really around, hopefully in this level 2 text, being able to think about creative and innovative ways that this industry can meet the policy objectives that have been set, maybe not in the same way that we see them met in the traditional finance world, for example, but allowing them to be met, for example, through the use of data, looking at, not necessarily always reporting requirements, for example, but look at what data is already available and freely available and that regulators can make use of, rather than putting additional burdens on this sector, which aren't necessary. They might fit the same bill as what we expect to receive when we're a regulator, having firms that are regulated report to you. But in this instance, because of the underlying technology and its transparency, that we don't actually necessarily need the same reporting requirements. So I think, those are sort of two things where they're not even necessarily criticisms, but as we go through this next phase of MiCA, that I think is very important to keep in mind, sort of the practicalities of what can be achieved given the technology, for both the positive and negative, and how we, obviously that's going to require, I think, a big effort. We're already seeing that from the regulators, bringing in industry to have this sort of dialogue about, how do we actually make this work in practice? Because I think, no matter where you sort of sit, from a policymaker, regulator, or industry perspective, getting this right and making it as administrable as possible is actually going to be really, really important. And that's the phase that we're in now. Even though at the same time we're already looking ahead to some of the things that were left perhaps a little bit on the side and thinking about what might be coming down the track, whether that be DeFi or NFTs and so forth.
Thanks, Caroline. Hugo, what's your take on MiCA from a CAS perspective? You probably have a good insight as you touch a lot of those issues that are being covered in MiCA.
Yeah, sure. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invite. Let me start with the international dimension, which was the first part of the question that you've asked. So obviously, I think there's a broad expectation, the reasonable expectation that MiCA and the EU standards will influence the rulemaking across the world. And I think this will happen through basically two channels. The first one is that other jurisdictions are inspired by MiCA. I don't think they will copy all aspects of it, in particular stablecoins. I agree with Ondrej there. And that international or global standard setters also are inspired by MiCA. And we've seen that in the FSB consultation to a large extent, which brings a lot of the detail of MiCA into the recommendations. But also through this trend will also happen via companies that by implementing the rules in Europe might do it actually across the globe, across their jurisdictions across the globe. I think it's too early days to say in what areas exactly that will happen, but I think that's a reasonable assumption because it will probably bring efficiencies to a lot of global companies like ours. In terms of the impact on the industry and from the perspective of the CASP, I think it's always good underlying, and others have done it, Gabriel in particular, that the underlying assumption behind MiCA is a very important one, is that crypto assets are to some extent different from traditional financial assets, and to that extent that the regulation needs to be bespoke, needs to be adjusted. So this is a very important starting point because it is what prevents us from falling into the trap of trying to simply shoehorn existing rules on the sector. MiCA, I think, is reasonably well integrated with the rest of the financial regulation landscape. It's the way I see it is sort of a safety net that sits beneath MiFID for anything that slips through the cracks of MiFID. It also, on the stablecoins, is very well integrated with EMD. Actually, it builds on the Electronic Money Directive. But at the same time, it recognizes that crypto assets are somewhat different, and therefore the rules need to be somewhat different. Again, that is something that is very important to stress, and that we welcome. In terms of the impact, and just to finalize, I think we're all looking at how the industry will change and evolve on the back of the certainty provided by the regulation. And I think we're all conducting our own impact assessments, legal assessments, business assessments. I think it's obvious that the market will be, because of the harmonization of the rules, we're going to create a level playing field. There's going to be probably concentration in a few financial centers. There's going to be more transparency, market integrity. So some of the criticism that the industry sometimes faces about being a Wild West, hopefully will go in the direction of correcting some of the, or taking away some of the reasons for those criticisms. The way, like some very concrete things, like the way we provide custody services, the listing policies, the transparency around that, the number of coins that are listed, some of those things will have to change to some extent. And stable coins will have to converge to the two very prescriptive models that the regulation provides for. So again, at a very high level, this is where we're going to go. But obviously, as Caroline mentioned, the level 2 rules, the definitions, the interpretations are going to be critically important. So now we have, just to give you an example, now we have a category for crypto assets, we have securities, we have an exemption for decentralization, we have an exemption for NFTs. So we have all the buckets there, but we don't know exactly where each single asset is going to fall, because the dividing lines, the definitions are not provided clearly. So I think the challenge for us and for the regulators is over the next year and a half to work together on getting this right, because the starting point is, I think, is very good. Everyone agrees to that. But if we get this wrong in this new stage, then it all goes to waste.
Thanks, Hugo. That's actually directly a question that I would like to ask Gabriel, because one of the things we want to discuss, for example, in those 2 days, And you can see it on the agenda, right? That we basically picked out key elements of MiCA, like stablecoins, for example, like DeFi, like NFTs, and some of the others. Could we maybe just quickly run through those three things? It's like, what is the end result, so that everybody, also the audience online that might want to learn about this, understands, is like, what is the outcome of MiCA if you have, or if you're in stablecoin issue? What is the outcome if you're a DeFi protocol? What does it mean for you? And last but not least, and that's a discussion that I've witnessed a lot in France, where basically the common sentiment was NFTs are not part of MiCA. Could you maybe clarify those three things for everybody? I know it's very easy. And I think because that's pretty much, I think, where we head to next, right? And Hugo just mentioned it. There's some blurred lines, and I think let's try to enlighten everyone on where we stand. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. And I hope might be as enlightening as you announced. But no, I mean, basically, I mean, the way Hugo presented it is the right one, that MiCA also provides for some categories and clarity, and public authorities don't know how to act other than just having boxes where you put what you see on the market, and then you know how to act on that. And that's also what provides clarity. Well, basically, MiCA defines two animals. It defines the CASPs, that's service providers, that I think there is not that much questions regarding what the frontiers of the CASPs is. And it's quite easy to see who you are talking with. And then again, the idea was we have a framework in the MiFID regulation. We know how to do that on traditional finance markets. We want to duplicate it for the specific underlying assets and technology. Then regarding the assets themselves, we had those discussions inside the council with the parliament, inside the parliament, and we changed our minds quite a few times, I have to say, typically regarding should the NFTs be inside the scope of MiCA or not. So in the end, the answer is no, not because there is no will to regulate NFTs, but because we thought it wasn't ripe in terms of understanding by the regulators to write something stringent on NFTs, because we don't know what we're talking about, basically. We don't know what we're talking about regarding the use cases and how the market, how the retail, how the corporates will make use of NFTs. So if I stay 2 seconds on NFTs, possibly in the next few years, the one or the other company that is running a business they say is based on NFTs will fall under the remit of MiCA. But not because MiCA hasn't been clear enough, but just because you can brand yourself as NFT if those NFTs are basically, in terms of substance, used as a means of payment. Well, the idea of MiCA is that we want to regulate crypto assets when they're used as a means of payments. So I agree with Ondrej. I mean, the implementation will be key, and that's where having a common framework at European level will be key, because you shouldn't be too dependent on the way the Latvian authority interprets what NFT is or is not versus what the French authorities say. Because, I mean, national authorities will be competent, but there will be some degree of harmonization. And when Ondrej said it's not a common framework, it's a unique framework, it's really important. I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with the European jargon and the European legal framework, this is a regulation. This is not a directive, and this is a key point. Because you made a reference to the French ecosystem, notably the gaming industry, which is quite developed in France, we had quite a number of discussions with them just to understand the difference between the NFT that is, a token gift in a game, in an online game, versus a means of payment. Of course, the frontier can be blurred at some time, but so far the use cases we have seen, the frontier is quite clear. So we wanted to provide clarity there, and hopefully supervisors will be able to say, no, okay, you do not fall into the remit of MiCA. Then coming into the stable coins and into the categories. There is no stable coin category in MiCA. And whenever we had talks and official communiques, for instance, we took great care of talking about so-called stable coins, just because this is not a legal category. MiCA creates 3 asset categories. It creates the EMT. EMT is money. So this is your stable coin based on one specific currency. This is the easiest category to understand. This is the easiest to regulate. And this is where probably there is no question for business, because there are no restrictions. The only restrictions are if you brand yourself as money, you should offer the consumer transparency and guarantees as money. So hence the requirements on reserves, etc. Then the ART. So there you have this mixed category that is based on a number of different underlying assets. There again, the philosophy of MiCA, and that's probably where Ondrej thinks that the final compromise, because this is how legislation is done in Europe, this compromise is a little bit too restrictive. You say, okay, we don't want those things based on multiple underlying assets to emerge as a competition to official money. So that's plain and simple, and assumed on the council's part, that's where the thresholds and the caps are, which doesn't mean that the cap are rocket science. Of course, this is a compromise again. That's where probably we'll need to see how the markets develop, and maybe the threshold will need to be revised up or down, because the question will be a question of use cases. If ART with huge volumes develop, but that they're just assets where you invest, no need for cap. The only need for a cap if it becomes money, it becomes a means of payment. Then there is the third category, which is typically Bitcoin or other assets where you do not have an identified underlying assets. And there, this is the fallback category. Again, there is no question regarding the threshold, because what you want to regulate if it becomes a payments means, and there MiCA provides the idea that it shouldn't become a means of payments of, let's say, universal use in Europe. If it becomes that, then it should fall into the category of money. So you need to transform yourself into an EMT. If it's just a means of investing, well, you just invest. And what we will be looking at is transparency, market integrity, consumer protection. Regarding DeFi, a little bit of the same kind of reasoning as NFTs. We don't know yet how to regulate DeFi and what kind of regulation it needs. Maybe the answer in 2 years or 3 years' time will be, well, no need for a specific regulation of DeFi, because such thing as real DeFi just doesn't exist. And that's the question that is an open question to the minds of regulators. Does DeFi as something where no one can be identified as being a key actor in the ecosystem of DeFi is identifiable? If someone is identifiable, like a CASP acting on a DeFi ecosystem, well, you capture the CASP, so we know how to regulate that. But if the promises of the DeFi in the purest form are fulfilled, then yes, we'll have to raise the question of if there needs to regulate that, either because you want to protect consumer from risks that are arising, or because you want to regulate the market to avoid that some DeFi protocols take too much of a share, and that creates problem. I don't know if I have answered your question, but of course, and again to build on what Ondrej said, we'll be really keen for you guys to continue the lobbying and the feedback, because that's now that we will be entering into the operational phase of MiCA. So we need to see if it's functional or not. Of course, legislation is brand new, so everyone coming saying, okay guys, this is scrap and you should scrap everything and rewrite it, it won't work. But we need the feedback on how you guys can find solution to operationalize inside the framework of MiCA.
Thanks, Gabriel. Talking of feedback, maybe Ondrej, Hugo, Caroline want to give feedback on what just been said. Is there anything that you think was missed out or not elaborate enough? Although I think that was very thorough, so thanks for that. Is there any other points that I think from a co-legislative perspective should be mentioned or highlighted? And then I give it over to the rest of you.
I think it was very detailed presentation of those issues, but I think they were critical also for the final agreement on how the regulation actually looks like today. I think to be honest, on DeFi and NFTs, those two issues were not part of the European Commission's proposal. They were actually dealing with some other issues, but since the very beginning, it was clear that this has to be somehow tackled. And I think the approach that was finally taken by both co-legislators actually to basically mentioning the issue, but postponing it in a time when we have more data, maybe better structured marketplace, and also maybe better ideas and better view how we can actually incorporate this in MiCA was a good decision in the end. I think where the difficulties will arise in implementation, it is exactly where these areas, NFTs or DeFis, meet with what is already regulated in MiCA. And I think this would be the most difficult part of it. Because on one hand, and that's about how we look at it. On one hand, we say that there are exemptions, but on the other, we can see that there are actually already rules in place which have to be applied. So I think, the debate on NFTs was I think very much under this angle. It will be the same in my view with DeFi, and I think for the next stage of what will be actually the regulatory framework for these particular issues, I think the feedback will be also critical, because now the Commission will be empowered actually to work on those files and then to actually present it to us and see what we can do with it in terms of the regulatory framework. So I think this is just to highlight where I think the critical parts of the implementation will be in these two specific areas, because actually those were the newcomers into discussion when the negotiations on the Council and the Parliament's side started and on both sides. It took 2 years, which was quite a long time. And throughout these 2 years, there was a lot of developments in the industry, a lot of developments in the markets. And I think that the discussion of the co-legislators was always trying to sort of reflect that, to better, to worse. But I think in the end, that's how we managed to cover it. And I think the critical part will be now the specific work on these issues.
So maybe just a follow-up, talking of 2 years, decision time. That's a very long time in the blockchain and crypto environment. What do you think, looking at it from where we stand now, will MiCA be still up to date when it's entering into force? Or are we already seeing things that we should already address somewhere else?
I guess, I mean, to answer that question briefly, and then perhaps to come back to a couple of things that Gabriel mentioned, I think look, the industry is going to continue to evolve. If we think about where all of this started, Libra or pre-Libra, the ICO boom, I mean, these things are things which perhaps not even so relevant today. So a lot of focus on ARTs, for example, yet we don't really see any of those models in the market at the moment. Without a crystal ball, not being able to see what comes next, but without a question, I mean, it's a very innovative space. I often like to think about the iPhone and the fact that, when it was created, it was like, well, how can I take smartphones, take calls on the move, and I can get email on the move. And then today we use them for a whole bunch of use cases that we didn't even think, it wasn't even on our minds at all when it was first developed. But I want to actually also come back to a couple of things that Gabriel mentioned, because I think, I guess one thing that I hadn't really heard before, and then perhaps something which, coming back to this question of, what are the objectives, and also this question of sort of reviewing the effectiveness, at a certain point, looking back and thinking, have we achieved what we wanted to achieve here? And I think obviously from a definitional perspective, when we think about stablecoins, there's these two groups, the ARTs and the EMTs. But I think the reality is that the legislation itself also makes another distinction. And this comes back to thinking about what's the policy objective. And that other distinction, of course, is between your foreign-backed, non-European currency-backed EMTs, and bring them within those threshold limits as distinct from your European currency-backed EMTs. And I think that's quite interesting because it really brings a different policy objective into mind. And so if we're thinking just about questions of financial stability, then we can understand, and there's lots of elements in there in terms of, keeping your peg, or in terms of making sure you have the liquidity and what's the capital backing, and so on and so forth. When we start to think, though, about this distinction between a European-backed EMT and a foreign-backed EMT, we start to see almost another policy objective come in, I think, which is really around monetary sovereignty. And I think, it's a sort of a very understandable policy objective for Europe. We do see a predominance in the market of US dollar-backed stablecoins. But I think this when we think about reviewing of the legislation, whether we've been effective, it's important to sort of think about not just what was written in the legislation, which is ultimately a proxy for what we're trying to achieve, but really think about what the underlying objective was. So, that question of really looking back and thinking, well, did this support sort of monetary sovereignty? Have we gotten to where we wanted to get with this objective? So I think it's important to make sure we're clear about why these different distinctions were made, even if, at a definitional level, you just have two groups. The reality is there is a further, a nuance, a further distinction in the legislation. And perhaps the second thing I thought was quite interesting was around this question of DeFi. And I think, the industry regulators are very much tackling this question of, there is a spectrum of decentralization. At which point do you fall out of the DeFi bucket and into the CeFi bucket? And, what are the factors you need to look at to even think about, what's relevant there? Is it just around governance? Are there other aspects that you're having to look at? But something I heard, which I perhaps hadn't heard so much before, which is around this question of, were there certain protocols which are more dominant in the market? So, just this, and that was quite an interesting angle. And is that really about concentration risk? Is that about competition? Just trying to understand, I think, a little bit more, what's the policy objective when we're thinking about, MiCA 2, whatever we might call it, looking forward to that DeFi space. Well, what are we really trying to achieve there? Again, what are the policy objectives? And that was just something I hadn't heard before. I thought was quite interesting as well.
Thanks, Caroline. I know, Hugo, you have also quite a view on stablecoins, also considering your background. So maybe you want to tell a bit about that.
Yeah, okay. So there were a number of things that I wanted to respond, but let's start with stablecoins. I think the discussion on the limits is one area where I think we've collectively failed in the discussions, simply for the fact that there was the final technical trilogue, not even a political trilogue. And we were still wondering, what is this? How does it affect us? What is the purpose? And so there was no clear view on the impact. There was no clear even view on how to apply it. So again, I think on the side of policymakers, we have not seen enough debate, and we as an industry didn't raise this point early enough and didn't engage early enough and didn't start this discussion early enough. So collectively, on both sides, I think we fell on that one, because I think it's unacceptable that USD stablecoins account for 75% of the market, and at the very final day, we're still wondering if they will still be allowed or not. So I think we failed there. The solution, or the situation where we are now, I think it is sensible. Let's not go into the technicalities, but I think it solves the problem. It provides sufficient clarity for us to go on. I think it's pretty clear, in going to the policy objectives that Caroline was alluding, that there is, in the political discourse in Europe, there is an ambition for the industry to move towards euro stablecoins, and I think the market will take steps towards that direction. The macroeconomics have changed, so now we don't have negative interest rates anymore. So the economic case for it sort of improved quite significantly. There's probably appetite from users as well to be able to enter the crypto system with a euro stablecoin, because it reduces exchange risk. And again, there's political appetite. So I think it's obvious, and a number of players have already moved in that direction. But it's clear that the market will at least look into that. But we don't know how fast, and we don't know how pervasive and how big these things will become, and what their role is going to be. Because if we talk about trading is one thing, if we move into payments, of course, is a very different animal, and then we have to enter a discussion about CBDCs and so on. It's more complex. So that was on stablecoins. Let me just make very briefly a few points on the other issues that were discussed. On NFTs and DeFi and the review, and the idea that some MiCA sort of parked some issues where we didn't have sufficient clarity. I think it's important to respect that agreement and to stick to it, and to allow ourselves time to discuss it, because there's a number of other files where discussions are ongoing now, in particular on AML, where all these issues are coming back to the table. And I think that's legally, that would be the wrong way to do it, because you're just amending stuff that you've written in one file in the other. So legally, this becomes very messy. But it honestly destroys the purpose of providing clarity to everyone and setting up a proper process to review things and to come to a well-informed view on how to regulate it. So at this stage, honestly, we have a demand for regulators, is like, we've agreed on MiCA, we have a process for review it, let's just do it responsibly, let's contribute, let's do it evidence-based, and not try to reopen these debates every other month, because it doesn't help. Just one on NFTs and decentralization briefly. On NFTs, this idea that we can reclassify some NFTs if they are interchangeable, it's very hard. So the regulation suggests that, as it's written now, that NFTs in a large collection could be deemed crypto assets. We don't see that, in all honesty. I mean, even when they're in large collections, they're not perfectly interchangeable, and the price correlation is not perfect. So while there might be a point in, bringing them into MiCA for some purposes, like market integrity, it would be extremely difficult. It's very difficult for me to see how we would comply with rules around like best execution or investment advisory, something like that. So if ever an NFT is brought into the scope of MiCA, you might have to consider how to apply MiCA, whether to apply it in full or not. There's one point. And on decentralization, I fear that the starting point for this discussion is wrong often. Because as Caroline was saying, we need to recognize that decentralization exists in a spectrum and is often a gradual process. So these two things are important. The third thing is that we tend to portray and present decentralization as a bad thing. And I think we should also start discussing if there's some benefits in it, if there's something that decentralization brings that helps us to achieve policy objectives, and to look at things in the balance. And this idea that just because there's, even in full decentralization, there is no accountable, there is no liable person, it's not necessarily, that should not necessarily be a reason to ban it. There might be other ways for us to make use of decentralization by incentivizing or decentivizing CeFi players to interact with some decentralized protocols or not. So there's other things that can be done to ensure the policy objectives, which we must acknowledge and always achieve. But the discussion should start with, is this useful for something? Is this good? What does it bring? And then what are the risks and how we address them? But if we just say, oh, it's not, there's no entity, then there's no liability, we cannot have it. Yeah, we will not end in a good place, I don't think. And it's not consistent with the spirit of MiCA.
Thanks, Hugo. Very quickly, because I really would like to maybe allow some questions. Do you guys want to comment on what just been said in a very brief manner, if possible?
No, maybe just rounding on the fact that regarding NFT, I mean, I concur that so far we haven't, from our knowledge, been at least at the French Ministry of Finance and French supervisors, we haven't seen a case where existing NFTs on the market would fall into MiCA. I think maybe just a remark on that, and again liaising to the idea of implementation. Implementation will be done mostly by supervisors. Supervisors meaning traditional supervisors, because we won't, and that's for sure, I think at this stage, we won't create specific crypto supervisors. It might have been an equation, but frankly, I mean, this is not the idea because the customers are the same. So you want to protect them and you want to protect financial stability with the guys who are entitled to do that for traditional finance. Of course, there can be a bias in the heads of our supervisors, colleagues, to try to drag this new industry into the old boxes. I think one of the most powerful interests of MiCA there is that it provides some form of a protection against that kind of thinking, even unconsciously, because there is now a framework. So now it's only a question of having two pieces of legislation being articulated together. Just mentioning typically the work of the Basel Committee on how banks should be allowed or not through potential requirements to interact with the crypto industry. And it will be critical because, again, when there is no money, I mean, the banks and the banking funding will be all the more critical for the industry. So you want to have sound relationship. You don't want to restrict it too much. Of course, it will be all the more easy for us and for you guys to say, guys, I am regulated, so don't take too cautious of an approach. You know how to deal with crypto investment by a bank. And I think that's really important. And that's where MiCA, even with probably some imperfection, maybe in 3 years from now, we'll say, okay, ART is a nice intellectual category, but it just doesn't exist in reality and won't exist. And okay, that's not a problem. In fact, the only thing that's useful is that some of the categories in MiCA will fit the market and will be useful for the market. If there are empty categories, no big deal. The problem would be if there are categories of real animal in the market that are not tackled by the legislation.
Thanks, Gabriel. Ondrej, maybe. We have 2 more minutes, so please keep it short.
Yeah, sure. I think many interesting points were raised in this regard. I think on the DeFi, I wouldn't say the sort of the most preoccupying sentiment around the table was a sort of a fear of unknown. I don't think this was really the case. I think it was more about actually how to accept this regulatory challenge because it is a challenge, and also. Which is, and also at the same time, a trend which is under very fast development in the market. And I think this was how we can reconcile those aspects. And in my view, yeah, we've taken a reasonable approach to actually to come back to it in a later stage. But I think it doesn't actually take away some of the challenges that will be ahead of us when we come back to it. That's for sure. But at the same time, I think it was there was a concern about level playing field, and also concerned about not having a loophole in the regulatory framework, which can actually then take a lot of efforts out to certain part of the market, which would have an exemption and would not be sort of under the rules of MiCA. So I think those were more the concerns that we were exchanging around the table. And to be honest, it is actually not only intellectual, but it is regulatory and challenge on many other levels. But I think let's see what the Commission actually comes up with, and how this can actually fit into the framework. And I think as for the NFTs, now as I mentioned in the previous answer, now really the most difficult points are where it meets. I mean, you mentioned that and I was not also fully convinced about the necessity to legislate on the fact that some parts of NFTs can actually become a means of payments. But to be honest, if you look at it in complexity of MiCA, this is a sort of a bridging provision. So you bring the NFT. This is where you actually sort of stick that area to the existing regulatory framework. You create a bridge, and the rest of it actually is for a later stage. But I think this will be also in other points which we discussed. This will be the in my view, the same principle. But I think the key, and maybe that's one of the takeaways that I would like to sort of send forward. I think when we went through the discussion on MiCA, on many issues, we were actually, in my view, taking this prescriptive approach. And I think, and let's see how the implementation proves it. But I think more reasonable would be actually to just keep the principles and start from something that we know that will not change that quickly. Like we did the categories, definitions, CASPs, assets, etc. And then just coming to the more detailed parts in the later stage of the application, because I think that how normally, if you come up with brand new legislation, how it should work. So I think when we discuss some of the details that you mentioned, that may be also that we've taken too prescriptive approach, and at some point in the implementation, we may see that in order to remain pertinent and relevant for the market, it actually makes sense to legislate more on principles rather than coming strictly with the details and the points to mention. But this is, in my view, one of the questions that should be raised throughout the implementation, and one of the aspects that we'll be definitely happy to see as a part of the feedback from the industry on application of MiCA.
Thanks for that. I think that's a great conclusion. Actually, unfortunately, we have to finish the panel. I would love to discuss it further, because there's actually, as you said, there's so much still to be done. And it's really important that we as an industry and all the participants here use the opportunity to actually talk to our MEPs and talk to our member states and the experts that they are, because it's a collaborative effort, right? And I think, as you've seen, there's a lot of clarity there, but there's also still some room to improve and work on. And that's what I would like to encourage everybody also online, that talk to your policymakers. They're really open to discuss. There's still a learning from both sides, I think, on how the technology works still on some of those aspects, and how policy is made, right? It's not a one-way approach. And I think that was the aim of this panel, that's the aim of this conference. And as you've seen, we set the stage now for a lot of the other panels that we'll discuss in more detail. So I hope everybody enjoyed this. Thanks for our panelists. Please give us a hand. And There will be a short break now, and then we follow up.